Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys was the first person to record Punch and Judy in 1665, and there's a Punch and Judy Association. And I once had to do an interview with them on the beach at Eastbourne in the middle of a howling gale. And they brought me, while I was talking, tea and biscuits. And the digestive biscuits flipped off the tray into the sand. So I never got my biscuits. It's one of the oldest associations. And that's the end of the trivia quiz for the day. So, Chris, are we ready to go?
Yes, I think that we are expecting quite a few more people, but I think I'll just let people in as they join. But I think we should probably kick things off at this point.
We'll give them 1 minute. Okay, let's get underway. First of all, I'm not Jill Pitt-Keithley, just in case you were wondering what was happening. I'm Robin Hodgson, another officer of the group. Jill, unfortunately, has a hospital appointment today, so I'm standing in for her. We have a very interesting report to discuss. We've got some presentations, 3 presentations, and then since this is an issue which is very much uppermost in people's minds, we've tried to leave aside plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentations. In the meantime, of course, there is the chat function, and if you have questions that you're burning to get over, one of the places to put them would be in the chat function, so Chris Walker and I can pick them up and fit them into the question and answer session when we get there. I've been asked to remind you all that this session is being recorded. So if you do not wish your words to be kept for posterity, either don't speak or leave the meeting. But I'm sure all you're going to say is going to be completely crystal clear and totally inoffensive and you're ready to live with the consequences. So we have 3 speakers. We have, first of all, Dr. Sanjiv Lingayah, who is a racial justice researcher, writer and consultant. He's leading on various projects on reframing race with Voice for Change England and the Runnymede Trust. And he's going to give us 8 minutes of undiluted truth on this important subject. Dr. Lingayah, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks everyone, and Chris in particular, for organising this session. Right, okay, so I will do this. I've got 8 minutes, so not very long, but I'll do my best. So just to give a bit of context, I was the lead researcher and author of a report called Home Truths, and I'm very glad that a year on from the publication of that report that we're gathered to reflect on it, and also some of the changes that are occurring in the charity and voluntary sector in the direction of racial justice. So my talk is around this theme of what does a life-affirming racial justice focused third sector look like, and I'm trying to it's work around which I'm very focused, and we're also planning in September or October this year to start Home Truths 2, which is very much looking at some of the solutions and how we can move forward in the direction of racial justice in the sector. What I should say is Home Truths, I have to commend my excellent ACEVO colleagues, Christiana Rickson and Maisie Horbert, who co-authored the report with me, and the project itself was a collaboration between Voice for Change England and ACEVO. So that's all the thank yous out the way. So I'll begin. And essentially, in 2017, I reached out to ACEVO to see if we might be able to do some work around what was then largely being called a diversity agenda, on the idea, could we use that agenda where there seemed to be some energy to talk about race and racism and racial justice in the charity sector. And they agreed, and here we are a few years later. The animating spirit behind the work, I think, is best summed up by this quote by James Baldwin, and he says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I think one of the things that we certainly found out during the interviews and with a large e-survey as part of the work is that there has been a sense that the charity sector, because of its good intentions, has performed well on racial justice. And I think the last couple of years has really shown that to be an incorrect assumption. And I think Home Truth, we had various, I'm not very good at titling reports, but eventually we landed on Home Truth. So it's an idea of, can we hold up a mirror more effectively to the charity sector, and to think about what we might do more powerfully in terms of racial justice. And I'll talk about that a bit more. As I mentioned, one of the centerpieces, or one of the central ideas behind Home Truths was in the diversity agenda, which is sometimes an EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion agenda. One of the things that we were noticing is the voice of racially minoritized people had often been absent from that conversation. So one of the central pillars of Home Truths was to center the experiences of racially minoritized people who are in the charity sector or who had recently been in the charity sector. And we had an e-survey, we had about 500 responses, in part, I know John's here today, in part because of our friends at Charity So White, who helped to spread the word about our e-survey. And there were lots of different responses and questions. Unfortunately, it makes for quite grim reading. I'll just do a few edited, lowlights really. 68% of respondents had experienced, witnessed, or heard stories about racism during their time in the charity sector. So there's a kind of atmosphere in which, for racially minoritized people, racism is a live thing. Half of the respondents felt they needed to be on their best behavior in order to fit in the sector. And in this case, 116 people, which is about a quarter of our respondents, stated that their personal experiences of racism had had a negative or very negative impact on their health and emotional well-being. So this stuff is live and it has negative impacts. Because I'm whistling through, we had lots of actions. I think there were 15 recommendations in the report, some of which is kind of practical things like publishing ethnicity pay gap data, expanding criteria in hiring and so on. But the one I'd like to most draw people's attention to is number 4 here. And one of the things that we've begun to understand is that this agenda of dealing with racism and moving towards racial justice is not, it's not about headcount. It's not simply about who works for you or who's on your board. It really is much more about charities thinking about how does the agenda of racial justice fit in and how is it part of the work that they do in the world. And for us, that was a really kind of critical insight. And that's one of the things that we're encouraging in terms of practical actions. How are charities standing with people affected by racism? So that for us is a critical question. Lots of practical things. I only flag this up just to give you a sense of, so we can make a decision that we want to move towards racial justice. There are lots of follow-up questions as a result, including the first one in column 1, which I think is very important. Why do we want this change? And colleagues from Mind are here, and you know that they'll no doubt speak about that issue. And I think why really matters, because it will affect the seriousness, the resource commitment, and the degree of change, and it really affects the idea that change is irreversible and ongoing. So we're doing, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are doing a second piece of work called Home Truths 2, and it's called Further Faster. And thanks to my colleague from ACEVO, Christiana Rickson, for coming up with that subtitle. I said I'm not very good at doing titles. And there are 3 strands to this. So Home Truth, the first report, flagged up the problems, and I think kind of unfolded in front of the sector some of the issues that affect our sector. This Home Truth 2 is much more about solutions. So the first strand is about foregrounding serious solutions. So we want to showcase people who are trying, so not necessarily doing, because this is ongoing work, to take big, bold steps in the direction of racial justice. And this is partly because I think we all face a bit of the tyranny of the blank page, because we don't know what institutions that center racial justice look like necessarily, because we're not surrounded by them. So that work is hard. So we're foregrounding serious solutions. We're putting together a cohort of Further Faster leaders in the recognition that there are some organizations and leaders who are ready to go far and fast, and so the question is, what can we do to support their work? And the third element, and this is very much from the feedback that we had from racially minoritized people in our first survey, is how can we change the conditions for people who are experiencing racism in the sector or have done so? So what are the support mechanisms, what are the reporting mechanisms, and so on? So I just want to make this kind of final point, which is, this is ongoing work. Change is in reach. I also want to talk about that there will be mistakes along the way. So we will make mistakes because we don't know, this is a path not very well trodden. So I think that is really important. I would also like to reflect on the fact that 15 months ago, obviously we weren't talking, I've been invited to lots of sessions, and we weren't talking about race and racism in the way that we are now. So that's a bit of a problem in the way, because racism existed before George Floyd was murdered, and it certainly exists afterwards. But I think this is also a moment of possibility. The last thing I'd like to say is, this is terribly bad form because I'm quoting myself here, but I wrote a piece for Third Sector a while back, and for me,
it's 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. I'm sure. Okay, right. Sorry, I'll just finish up and then I'll be done.
Thank you.
And one of the things I said was, while racism erases people's history, humanity, their possibilities, and their lives, charities should be working to heal and restore wholeness. So I think this journey towards achieving racial justice is at the center of why charities should exist and what our sector should stand for. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Without any pause, we'll go straight to our second speaker, John Cornejo, who's a campaigner, organizer, and anti-racism specialist. He's worked in the charity sector as a campaigner for almost 10 years and works with a charity called Charity So White. John, 8 minutes starting now.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a quick note on language. I'll be using the terms BAME and POC today, but I want to acknowledge that neither of them is perfect. Both terms flatten people's identities and don't speak to specific problems like anti-blackness in our society. Language around all of this isn't perfect, but I want to speak generally about the ways in which racialized people experience oppression within the charity sector. Charities So White is a BAME-led grassroots campaign looking to tackle institutional racism in the charity sector. We want the charity sector to take the lead to root out racism from our society. The work of activists like ourselves over the last year has put anti-racism firmly on the agenda for charities all over the country. And the Home Truths report last year also showed that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people working in the charity sector have been itching to talk about racism in the sector for a very long time. But where are we now a year later? The recent release of the Racism, Power and Truth report by Bond shows that as a sector, we are still talking about whether racism exists. And meanwhile, a lot of the findings from Home Truths are still ongoing. Whilst BAME people continue to suffer racism in the workplace and white savior narratives persist in our work. The needs that charities seek to address often disproportionately impact the lives of people of colour. And as a sector, we do not reflect the communities that we serve, and this stops us from understanding their needs effectively. Just 9% of charity employees are BAME. BAME employees represent just 5.3% of senior leadership roles in the sector. And people of colour are also unlikely to find themselves in positions where they can hold leaders to account, as 92% of charity trustees are white. But whilst the last year has seen a number of organisations make commitments to become anti-racist, and lots of conversations and work has started, many of the conversations on racism across the sector aren't going deep enough, and we're at a very early stage still. There has been little systemic change so far. People of colour continue experiencing racism within charities. People of colour continue to be the ones pushing for meaningful anti-racist change inside their organisations. Whilst the conversations we are having tend to only scratch the surface, and we see that progress towards the sort of change we want to see is very slow. I think the charity sector's risk-averse culture, coupled with a fear of saying the wrong thing, stops us from having meaningful conversations on how racism operates in our organisations and how it shapes our work. We should commit to open and honest conversations about racism in our organisations, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because getting this right will enable us to do much better work. Having more relevant lived experience in our leadership and boards will mean that we better understand the needs of the communities that we serve. We will make better decisions on how to invest our funds and resources. We'll better support communities of colour in the UK and around the world. And we will give power and agency to those that we support. So how do we get there? This APPG should explore this issue of racism in the charity sector in more detail and investigate what tangible progress is being made towards anti-racist change in our organisations across the sector. MPs should talk to local charities in their areas about racism and what leaders are doing to tackle it. We have articles within the House magazine and the IPPR Progressive Review, which can help you with these conversations and think about what we need to raise. Lastly, we invite you all to meet with us and discuss this issue further. And the most important thing is just to hear from people of colour ourselves in terms of what we're experiencing and what's happening, to centre our voices within the conversations. We're no longer talking about whether racism exists in the charity sector. We are talking about how we can change in order to build racial justice into our work so that we can better serve our communities. Thank you.
Commendably brief, well done. You'll get an extra biscuit and break for that. Thank you very much indeed. So we go straight on again now to Francis Brown and Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer is the Chief Executive of Mind and has some roles within the NHS. And Francis is a diversity, inclusion, governance, organization development and leadership professional and trustee. That's a mouthful. And they are going to go tell us from their point of view. Over to you too.
Thank you very much, Lord Hodgson, and thank you to both John and Sanjiv for the really important work that both your organisations have done in really setting the scene and really shining a light on the significant issues that we as a sector face in tackling institutional racism. You may or may not have seen that about a month ago, Mind launched a new strategy, and inside that strategy is a really clear set of statements which read as follows: our ambition is to become a truly anti-racist organisation We will be an unflinching advocate for racial justice and mental health. Our support will be engaging and effective for people from racialized communities, and we will invest in building an inclusive organizational culture with diverse leaders. In the course of the next 6 or so minutes, we're going to try and describe what we've done over the last year to get us to the point of stating that as our strategic ambition. And we do so really in the spirit of sharing some of our learning over this period. Sanjiv asked the question earlier, it's really important for organizations to describe the why. And we have 2 whys in our context of mind. The first why is absolutely rooted in our cause of mental health and the relationship between racial inequality and mental health. People from racialized communities are more likely to experience a mental health problem, less likely to receive support, and have poorer outcomes from services. And the picture is deteriorating. In 2016-17, someone from a black community was 3.9 times more likely than a white person to be detained under mental health legislation. By 2019 to 2020, that has increased to 4.6 times more likely. So there are existing significant issues facing people from racialized communities in their experiences of mental health services. And as a mental health charity, we wanted to think particularly about our role in supporting people from those communities. But there's a deeper why for us as well. And as you've already heard from colleagues, I think we realized in the context of the murder of George Floyd and the work that had been done by Charities So White and the Home Truths report, that we were nowhere near not competent, not sufficiently able to be able to meet those the challenges that have existed if we really want to say that we want to achieve our overall mission that everyone experiencing a mental health problem gets support and respect. And so we heard that not just from people outside the organisation, but also inside the organisation as well. And we regarded that as a really important moment for us to reflect on what we needed to do to change from an organisation which over the years has campaigned on issues around the inequalities of people from black communities and racialized communities in the mental health system. We've also run programs in the past, but it was abundantly clear that what we had done historically wasn't nearly good enough. So we asked Frances to help us out, and I'm going to hand over to her to explain what she did to help us.
Hi all, good to be able to speak to you today. So I suppose the first investment was in bringing me in the organisation, deciding that they wanted to invest specific resources and capacity to develop this piece of work. And it set itself some objectives. So one of those was to understand the current default racial bias within the organisation, to compile insights and evidence to determine the actions that the organisation needed to take. They wanted to establish the need for change and how we'd be able to implement that in a positive and sustainable way. Create a plan and a blueprint for how we would take that journey, and also to increase individual and shared responsibility within the organisation for driving forward race equity. So one of the first things that we did was to run some reflective workshops with staff and local minds across the organisation, and those were facilitated by consultants who were not just specialists in race equity, but also are psychologists themselves, so able to manage those conversations sensitively and compassionately. We also then, after those, and we grabbed insights from those, ran some action workshops, and those action workshops were specifically focused on helping people with their action planning. We were going through the planning process, and to help them with that planning process and how they can look at their work differently and build race equity in. And alongside all of that, we did a data mapping process, looking at what the organisation had done historically in this area over the 75 years of its history. And also to develop a bit of a root cause analysis and to see how we were using data to inform our activities and our future actions. So we learned that the norms of whitelist are quite prevalent in the organisation. That's not a surprise. That's concurrent with what was happening in the sector. But we also realised that there was a bit of a dichotomy between what we call perceived rhetoric and current practice. So the organisation presenting itself as well-meaning, respectful, professional in its dynamics, but at the same time, that not necessarily playing out into practice in terms of reaching and addressing all audiences. So our drivers for change were therefore confidence and competence in working with racialised communities. We realised that was low, and that was something that we need to work on. That good intent is trumped by not knowing where to start. We have a lack of diverse perspectives in our decision making, and that means informing change is challenging. We struggle to know where to place EDI more broadly in the organisation to really effectively drive change. The current structure doesn't provide opportunities for relocating power or changing dynamics, and therefore upholds the status quo, and people therefore default to that status quo. Our hierarchical structures mean that race equity is viewed and filtered through multiple layers of leadership, and that's predominantly white leadership. So perspectives get filtered, and that there's a significant challenge due to institutional blind spots that manifest in diverse spaces. So our clear priorities is that we had to have a clear position and stance on race equity, provide safe and supportive spaces for staff and improve experience. We know that values, behaviours, and our values, behaviours and conduct framework is going to be really important. We need to increase leadership visibility and accountability, improve and increase equitable partnership approaches, how we work with other organisations, particularly those who are more specialised in these spaces. And we need to improve the content of our work, so it's not just race specific, but it's race inclusive. Back to you, Paul.
So I'm guessing we've got about a couple of minutes left. So just to conclude, our learnings from how far we've got, and I think as you've heard, we just want to be really clear, we're very much in the foothills of this work. It's the very, very early stages of what's going to be a very long journey. But our key learnings, I think, first of all, Francis referred to the impact of the effects of trauma, of racial discrimination, people not feeling they have a voice is really important part of the consideration. It's really important to support your staff, to be able to give them the voice, to be able to, and to feel confident that they have the voice, but also to recognize that that is hard for people and they need support in being able to have a voice in the organization. Secondly, this is clearly a leadership issue. We really have recognized as a group of predominantly white leaders that we bring our own white privilege to this issue, and it's something we have to work on. And it's also an issue for boards as well. And one of the things we've done is increase the diversity of our board in the course of the last year by recruiting a number of new trustees from diverse backgrounds. And thirdly, we know that we will probably lose people, staff, supporters and donors who don't necessarily agree with our stance on anti-racism. When we put out a tweet about Meghan Markle and Piers Morgan a few months ago, out of the responses that we had back, 20% included some racist comment. And we have to accept that that is a part of what we're going to be about as an organisation. And we also know that some people will walk away from us, and that's fine as far as we're concerned. And finally, as you've also heard from Francis, I think using data is going to be really important. And I think a number of us found that we didn't really have appropriate levels of data to really understand what was going on inside our organisation and indeed beyond, which is why our work with the NHS is very important in this area too. And then in terms of what we're doing next, Francis referred to our blueprint, which is the sort of document that we're using to shape our progress across the next few years. We see it as an organic document. It will change and evolve as we test and try out different approaches, but it has some very clear objectives inside it. It has some programs that we now need to develop, including focus on learning and development, program delivery, working with partner organisations across the voluntary sector to share some of the power that we have, and also monitoring progress. And so we hope very much that in future years we'll be able to give you a good quality update on the progress that we've been able to make. And I think for us as a sector, this is about us being open and honest about both successes and failures so that we can all learn from each other. We'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Right, 3 challenging presentations. We now open up to questions, and we normally give parliamentarians first crack of the whip, and when you've got this large number of people on the screen, just the names, I'm not sure I know exactly who are parliamentarians or not, so I hope parliamentarians will shout loudly. I saw my colleague Liz Barker somewhere, but she's gone now, but I hope she's still around, so I'm sure she's going to come in a minute. Perhaps I just take chairman's privilege. I was asked by someone at the last minute to go and have lunch with them today. And I said, no, I was chairing this very important meeting on the topic that we've just been discussing. And he said to me, how do you move from people turning up at these meetings who are already convinced of the case to widen it out to people who are not yet convinced, number one. Number two, when did genuine disagreement become racist? And number three, what did the speakers think about Tony Sewell's report, his commission report, published in March? Who would like to just have a crack at that? Sanjiv, go on. I can see you smiling, so you've got it.
Right. When
does genuine commercial disagreement become racist?
Well, I think it's really hard to answer that in the abstract or without an example. If I take, can I take the other two?
Sure.
The Sewell report is a poor piece of work for lots of reasons. You know, I have an academic background. It's badly researched, it's incomplete. And I think even the process, you have commissioners saying that they weren't shown the final report. So I think it's fundamentally flawed. Beyond those convinced, I think that's really interesting. So what we're doing with, so I think we have to run a twin strategy. We have to use things like the work of Charities. So why, like the example of mine, like the Home Truths report, to make the case that more people need to come on board with this agenda. But interestingly, what we've done with Home Truths 2 is that we've recognized that not everyone can come as fully as we want now. But there are those who will do that and that can do that now and can commit to that. And by helping them to do their work, we also kind of change the architecture of the sector as a whole. I think part of the struggles are that some people have good intention, but don't know what to do. And some of that's genuine. I think some of that can be problematic. But so I think you don't have to persuade everyone to have decisive movement. And sometimes you just have to go with those, like organizations like mine, who really want to press on the accelerator and support them. That will change the dynamic in the sector.
Okay. Paul, Francis, a quick word at all on that? No.
Should I kick off?
All right.
Tony Sewell report, yes, fundamentally flawed and disturbing to my soul. I don't think there's anything more to say on that. I believe that those people who are actively engaged and converts can create a tipping point. And I think there's significant enough organisations and momentum now to build on that and hopefully take other people with us.
Okay. Paul, you got to say, or should we go straight to John? John, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, so I agree with what's been said on the Sewell report, so let's just leave that there. But I think I'm going to take the question around sort of disagreement, because I think so often, like, the framing of that question is really telling to what's happening in the sector. Like, we've so focused on being called racist or sort of being perceived as racist, and we sort of take it as an attack. Whereas what we're actually talking about is it's systems of oppression. It's the little things, it's the ideas that are built into the fabric of our organizations and our society that mean that certain types of people benefit more than others. And I think when we're talking about anti-racism, it's about building a space where we can all bring our full selves and really talk about these things, talk about what you have to look like to be successful, what type of skills or type of background we look for in terms of someone that's going to make it to a leadership position. And I think that is quite an open and inclusive conversation that I hope leads to more openness and more collaboration, to be honest.
Good. Thank you. I can see Baroness Barker. I'm very pleased to call her because I managed to insult her in a committee meeting the other day by failing to mention her, and I'm still recovering from that shame. Liz, over to you.
Hi, hello. I'm speaking to you from my office in the House of Lords, just in case you thought I was in witness protection because the lighting is so bad. I suppose I want to focus on the issue. I struggle with the word intersectionality. I really do, for all sorts of reasons, because it's an American term, because they have intersections instead of roundabouts and stuff. And I don't think that anybody has ever truly spoken about the tensions that can arise between different minority groups. And I wonder whether, in your view, there is a particular need for charities who may exist to benefit one particular very small group within our society, to then, how do they then work through this issue of intersectionality? And I think the second thing is, do you agree with me that it's very difficult to be critical of anything within the voluntary sector? There is a kind of, we're charitable, how very dare you? Yeah. And how do we, in your experience, get around that?
Good point. Right, who's going to go first on that? Paul, you go first on this one.
I'll start. It's a great question, Liz. Thank you. Actually, I think the sector is getting better and better at criticising itself. So there's I think there's a shift in really holding a mirror up and looking at both our collective strengths and weaknesses. It's we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but nor is the public or the private sector. So I think we have to be honest about where some dynamics within the charity sector fall down, and I think this particular area is an area where I don't think we've served our beneficiaries or indeed our staff or volunteers terribly well on the whole, with some very notable exceptions. I think the question you ask about intersectionality is really important. I'm not a massive fan of the word, but I think where it's a useful way of helping us to understand that when we're talking about people's lives, they don't just simply exist within a box that we might have created for them. And certainly in the context of our thinking about our current plans for the next few years, where we've identified 3 areas of development, a particular priority, one of which is our work tackling racism, but the other 2 areas are work supporting young people and supporting people who experience poverty and mental health issues. We know that there is absolutely a crossover, if you like, or intersectionality between those 3 groups. And so we're very much thinking about how we support working not within our own self-described boxes, but thinking about it from the perspectives of the people that we're here to work with. And that
Paul, could you just, for the benefit of me and possibly for Liz, is crossover and intersectionality the same in your mind?
Well, I suppose it's a different way of describing the experience, the way in which we collectively think about the experiences of, particularly from our beneficiary point of view. Yes, I mean, I think we know, for example, that people from particular ethnic community, Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, are more likely to be in poverty. COVID has shone the light on the fact there's a greater precarity of jobs amongst Black and Asian communities in particular. We also know that young people are reporting increased incidences of racism. So these are, if you like, they are crossovers, but they also reflect intersectionality issues. And we'd also extend that into thinking, and this is an issue, Liz, I know you're very passionate about in particular, the broader relationship between a variety of equalities related issues and how we work to support all those equalities issues as organisations. And I think inevitably charities which have a predominance on a particular area, so in our case mental health, we understand well how to support the experiences of people with mental health problems. I mean, that's what we're here for, so we should be able to do that. But I think sometimes organisations are then consequentially less good at recognising the issues that people from other groups then experience, and that's something that I think we're really thinking about as we progress this work.
Okay, anybody want to come in on this? Sanjiv, do you want to come in? Oh, John, you'd like to come in, please.
John, please.
Okay,
I'll come back to you in a sec, Sanjiv. John.
Okay. Yeah. So I just I think that point on criticism is a really important one, and I think I agree with Paul that as organisations, I think we are talking a bit more critically about ourselves. We are sort of talking about mistakes a lot more, which is a really good thing. But I think as individuals, we are still deeply uncomfortable with challenging our work and sort of critique. And I think that really impacts how we talk about racism and intersectionality and equality and diversity in general, because these conversations end up being framed as attacks on our work, as critique. It's framed as, so you're saying that I'm not a good person. And I think that's still something that we really need to sort of grapple with in the charity sector. But I think on intersectionality, I agree a lot of the language around anti-racism is very academic, and that isn't always very helpful. But really, it's just answering the fact that I think we tend to like looking at a single issue at a time. But that kind of ignores the fact that all of us belong to a whole range of different communities. And it's really just about looking at the way that our individual experiences will be impacted by a lot of the different communities that we're part of. It's race and gender and other things. I think we overcomplicate it, but it's really just as simple as thinking about how do people experience oppression.
Sanjiv, you have the floor.
Okay, so two quick things. So on criticism, I think I agree with what's been said about perhaps there's more space for that now. I think one of the things I worry about is performance in the charity sector. So when in the Black Lives movement, there were lots of kind of statements of lying and so on. And I think what we need to do is make sure that words and these kind of conversations are followed up by practical action. I think that's the critical thing. So on intersectionality, so I think we're asking the word intersectionality to do too much work. So it's standing in place of complexity, it's standing in place of oppression and multiple oppression. So I think we need to, so the original of work, if you look for Kimberly Crenshaw's, I think it might have been her PhD. So in the US, there were two cases of Black people, women, who lost, I believe, a case because they were caught in the middle of being discriminated against because they were Black and because they were female, and they didn't quite meet the threshold of being discriminated against on the grounds of race and on the ground of gender. So they were kind of caught in this middle ground and having suffered discrimination. So I think intersectionality is most helpful when we think about kind of compound oppressions, how some people are caught in categories whereby they are double and triple whammied by the arrangements in which we exist. It's actually something I want to do a bit more work on because it's been spoken so much and people are kind of loading quite a lot of different things onto it. And I think in a somewhat unhelpful way. And so it's being said almost sometimes as a bit of a buzzword. So we're really thinking about it, well, what do you mean by that? And sometimes it can be used as a form of whataboutery. So in the race space, what happens is, okay, we want to do something about racism, but what about these multiple other groups who also suffer? What about working class people who are white who are suffering? So actually, in a strange way, it is blocking progress towards equity because it's being used as a defensive proposition.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes now. Are there any other parliamentarians that the chairman has failed to catch? If not, let's open it up. I see that Matthew Horbert has put something on the chat. Matthew, do you want to say anything now? Perhaps he's gone. No. Anyway, right, who else would like to have a go? You can't all be silenced. Chris, anybody you can see that it would...
Robin, Salma has got her hand up. Salma Ravat.
Right, please. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I haven't seen that.
I can see it.
Well done. You've got sharper eyes than I have. Okay, Salma.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
And my apologies again for not having seen your hand.
That's okay. So, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cough, not COVID related, thankfully, sorry. But I work in a homelessness charity in Leicester. I'm a founder and run the charity itself, and really fortunate that we have a very diverse board, workforce and volunteer engagement. But I don't know what the speakers think, but I actually find that the charity sector doesn't actually appeal as sort of the first choice of employment for a lot of individuals from the BAME community. And I was wondering whether you had some ideas of why that is. Is there some research around why that's challenging? I know I've got my own thoughts on it, but and also how we overcome some of those challenges. How do we make the sector more appealing so that we can start making some of that change from within? And I know that I'm very much in the minority. I attend meetings, I go to a lot of conferences. I'm usually very often the only female hijabi of Muslim heritage in the room, and that can be quite intimidating. But sometimes we can't make that change until we're in that sector. So any thoughts or ideas on that? Excuse me, thank you.
Somebody from mind, Paul, do you want to start on this one? Because trustees, choice of, selection of, finding new ones, etc.
Yes, thanks, Sam. It's a really important question. And I think one of the things we've noticed across our mine network, where we have 115 local mines across England and Wales, is that we have, in some areas, we're very successful in recruiting more diverse staff. And it starts with the leadership, both at board and senior management level. So I think there are some good examples of being able to do that. But I think more generally, there are, and I haven't got the figures to hand, colleagues may well, I think some of the sectors within the charities, the overall charity sector, the overall numbers are really concerning in terms of our collective inability to be able to really recruit and bring people in from more diverse communities. So communications, policy are two very strong examples of that, I think. I mean, in a bad way, I should emphasize. And I do think this is, risk of, I think this is an opportunity for the sector as a whole, but I think organizations who employ, all of us have got a role to play here, but I do think there's a sector-wide requirement here for us to think about how we as a sector are perceived by some communities from an employment point of view, in terms of what could we do. I can see Sarah Viber at NCVO here, because I think there's a real opportunity to think about what we could do to really reach out into communities at a number of different levels, at the both in terms of bringing, we're looking at some of this, bringing people into entry-level jobs as well as senior leadership jobs, as well as board roles, where we need to do some outreach. I think we've just become too reliant on the easy options, and we feel as though, to be slightly flippant, that we feel as though advertising in the Guardian is enough. And I think our experience is it isn't, and that's partly because the pool of people is not sufficiently diverse. And it's also because I think we just need to work harder to reach out to both individuals and communities to raise the profile of the sector as a place to come and work. And I think that's a job that's going to take time, and I think it's one of our reflections that this is going to be a long-term. It has to be a long program, particularly in the senior leadership space.
Paul, is this a job for ACEVO and ACEVO?
Well, as a former chair of ACEVO, I would never want to burden ACEVO or ACEVO with more work, knowing as I do, both organisations are not large enough to be able to, not as large as we would all like them to be. No. I think it's a job that we've all got to play. We've all got a role to play in this together, each and every charity. And I think those of us who are probably larger charities have got a bigger role to play because, partly because we recruit more staff. So I think we've all got a role to play. We have about 20% of our staff nationally are from a BAME, and if I use that terminology, background. But we know we've got a lot of work to do, particularly in the leadership space.
Francis, you do board representation. Do you want to come in on this? Trustee representation, sorry.
Well, I think board representation is an interesting one because it's an easier area to tackle. So Mind as an organisation is addressing its representation at board level, has increased the diversity of its board, wants to do more of that. The issues that we have are increasing the diversity of representation within the organisation at staff level and particularly leadership. That is a challenge. I think one of the things that doesn't attract people to the charitable sector is relevance. The charitable sector needs to feel relevant to individuals, and given that there is a low number of people from those backgrounds who are working in the organisation, you're not even interacting necessarily with people from your background who work in that sector. And there is some evidence to suggest that when people do come into the charitable sector, they come in at low levels and they leave. There's a pipeline issue. People don't go through the organisation to more senior positions. So, when you can't see something, when you can't see yourself, the idea of you being that becomes much more challenging. So I think relevance is at the root of that.
Right. Next question. Anyone want to add anything? I'm looking for. Chris, do you want to say anything about from NCVO's point of view about the trustees? Let's put the ball back in your court for a moment.
I was going to say we do actually have a couple of hands up.
You have a go first.
So we've got Diane Reid and Matthew Horbert both have their hands up.
All right. Diane, over to you first.
Hi, Diane Reid, Association of Chairs. I was interested in one of the things that Francis said about looking at what the organisation at Mind had done historically, and traditionally that's been a cause for concern. And I wondered what you had done to use the history, the provenance of the organisation to drive present change.
Right. Who's going to have a go at that?
I'll kick off on that.
Right. Thank you.
So, one, it was helpful to inform the way in which we have addressed issues of race. And one of the things that it told us is that we have dealt with that by doing specific programs aimed at specific communities. So we might do work with young Black men, we might do work with the Asian community. But what we hadn't done is look at our broader activity to make sure that it is inclusive. So that's one of the learnings that we had from it. We also learned that there were times when we were much better at this. And there was a point when the organisation was much more active around matters of race equity. And I think that speaks to sometimes the fact that the sector can get complacent. We think we've done it. We think we've cracked it. We think we're there. And I think there was a point maybe in the 90s where people thought they were there. And then they took their eye off the ball. It stopped being inclusion, stopped being a value that the organisation had. It stopped being something that was in people's strategies. And as a result, we've seen through our data and our history that our investment in those areas has declined year on year.
John, anything on this you want to say? Or are you content at the moment? Fine. Sanjiv?
No, that's good. That's good.
Do you want to come back? Diane, do you want to come back at all?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to add, Sanjiv, anything you want to add to that?
Not so much to that point, but can I just very briefly talk a bit about something that Salma asked, which is very brief. I think I looked in the NCVO almanac, and I think our sector has the highest proportion of short-term contract jobs compared to the public. So I also think one of the things that we need to do, and this is for everybody, is we need to have more better jobs. And I think that is also kind of critical. And actually, because of the way our sector is operating, I actually think that that's a bit of a concern, particularly in the light of what's happened in the last year or so.
Beverly Radcliffe, I see you made a point about Paul of the Guardian. Do you want to follow that up?
Thank you. No, it was just really agreeing with Paul, because I think there is an assumption there, and it's a very stereotypical assumption that all charity jobs will be advertised in the Guardian. And I think it is a matter of moving away from that and making sure that we as a charity do the work and make sure that we are seeking out those opportunities to recruit to a diverse pool of people. And I absolutely agree with what Francis said. I think we got it so right in the 90s, but somewhere along the line, it's really declined. And I think the sector is it's gone back to the Victorian era, where it's very white, middle class and female. I'm one of those people, I have to say, and I'm very, very sad to think that I am in the majority as opposed to the minority at the moment. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Chris, who else do we have? Anybody else?
Yeah, Matthew still has his hand up.
Right, over to you.
Hi, thanks. So, yeah, I'm Matthew Horbert. I was chair of a LGBT plus charity in Leicester until last year. I actually don't want to ask about intersectionality because that has been well and truly answered. So I want to ask, what impact does the framing government makes of the role of charities have to play on this agenda? So, I'm thinking of some of what's been said over the past 10 years by various charity ministers. So, for example, charities should go home and do the knitting, charities shouldn't be political, charities should stop campaigning. I personally feel that is an agenda to belittle the charity sector in our work. What role does that play, if any, on charities feeling good about themselves and feeling able to be more dynamic on issues like that's being discussed at this meeting? Thanks.
Right, well, that's a complex question. Francis, I'm going to pass that back to you.
It silenced charities to some extent, particularly charities who are campaign and advocacy charities. The framing has definitely moved organisations in a different avenue. I think that if you compare charities of a while ago to the ones we have now, they are less activist, more mainstream, and I think that has been the impact of successive stances from the government towards the sector.
Could I just say that I wrote the report reviewing the third-party campaign, so I have some lumps and bumps to show for it. I drew a distinction between what I call business as usual, that is to say, what a business does charity does all the time, and that seems to be uncontroversial. You then have political campaigning, which means you're ringing up people here at Westminster, which you're going to be doing as part of your developing your framework and hoping to get noticed within the ranks of government. And then there's electioneering and campaigning. That's obviously a much more difficult position, which is likely to be in the 6-9 months before an election. Inevitably, politicians are very sensitive about that. If your livelihood depends on it, it's not surprising. But where you have somebody who has taken a particular view on a particular issue, that is where the difficulty comes. And I suggested in my review that actually the way that campaigning was being defined in the Act needed to be revised and reformed. So there had to be intent to affect an election, rather than just, and there should be a legal test on that. And that was the best way forward to avoid what Frances described, I think. Well, if you didn't, so she's hinting at the chilling effect of this standing by. In fairness to many people, including the government at the time, lawyers have not helped. Lawyers have been quite unhelpful in the way they have interpreted it by saying, sharp intake of breath, I'd be very careful if I was you. So they have helped accentuate it in a way that more robust legal advice probably would have meant many charities could have been calmer and more relaxed about it. But that was where I ended up. And in due course, when we come to the elections bill, which is coming into the Commons shortly, will eventually arrive at the Lords, I intend to take advantage of a second reading speech and a few amendments to try and bring that back up the agenda again. But that is a month or two away from where we are today. Thanks, Francis. Paul, you'll say the others?
Well, I'll let me let John go first because I know he wants to contribute.
Sorry, John.
So that's a really, really good question. And I guess I spoke about risk-averse culture within my opening. And I think that's really relevant here because I don't know where it came from, but remembering working as a campaigner, there seems to be a real tension between sort of advocacy goals and wanting to sort of get close to the government in order to influence. And then kind of allowing the narrative of the government of the day kind of shape what level of risk we're willing to take, and kind of perceiving racism in general as something that's controversial and that might stop us from making grounds with the policy asks that we have. I think it does have a chilling effect over this conversation. But I think also on the flip side of that, we're also in a situation where the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the sort of conversations that are happening mean that charities have to talk about anti-racism and have to have a view of some kind and say something. So I think we're actually in quite a good scenario at the moment where we have to, as organizations, push back against that and kind of try and move away from that sort of controversy government line and framing, and just focus on ourselves and how we grow as organizations and how we have meaningful conversations around change for ourselves. And I hope that leads to some transformation.
Thank you. We've got, Paul, you've got 20 seconds if you want to say anything.
I would suggest that you should have another session on this as an APPG, because I think if it's about to be re-debated, this is exactly the moment to do it. And I think the context of anti-racism would really add extra value to a debate which we had a few years ago, where, as far as I'm concerned, as independent organisations, we should be free to say whatever we want.
Okay, right. Sadly, we've come to the end of the session. Thank you all very much for attending, coming along. It is obviously reaching out that makes this APPG a valuable and effective one. But particular thanks to our speakers, to Sanjiv Lingayah, to John Cornejo, to Francis Brown, and last but not least, to my fellow St. Peter's College alumnus, Paul Farmer. Thank you all very much again, and look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Bye for now.